Hi, I'm Sanaya.
And I'm Ketki.
And we're Thinking People. Today, we're thinking about love according to Sally Rooney, who has often been referred to as the voice of millennial angst. We talk about what makes Sally Rooney one of the zeitgeist-defining English language authors of the 21st century and what her popularity says about modern love, intimacy, desire, and relationships. We are joined by Aishwarya Shah, screenwriter, fiction writer, and literary enthusiast, whose writing has appeared in Hammock Magazine, Angeem Magazine, and who has also written for Adrian Grenier's docuseries Earth Speed.
Life moves fast. Tune in to think about it.
Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode. Hello, Ketki. Hi, Aishwarya. How are you feeling today?
I'm excited to see what you guys have made of Intermezzo.
I'm very excited to have you on board for this episode of Thinking People, in which we are going to be exploring the works of Sally Rooney, the author, Sally Rooney, the celebrity writer, Sally Rooney, the zeitgeist-defining voice of millennial angst, as she has been called. So I think just to set things up before we dive into a number of themes and topics that we want to explore through this conversation, we are trying to think about Sally Rooney and through the lens of Sally Rooney, examine what modern relationships are like. So broadly, we're thinking about two things over here. One is what makes Sally Rooney one of the zeitgeist-defining English language authors of the 21st century. And related to that, what Sally Rooney's popularity says about modern love, intimacy, desire, and relationships. So, I think an interesting place to start with is just who is Sally Rooney? What has she come to be known for? And why does her work tell us so much about the way in which we view relationships? So, really quickly, just going down a quick history of Sally Rooney, the author. She's Irish, of course. She, in recent years, has really captured the attention of the literary verse, book talk, of book Twitter, since at least 2018, when her breakthrough novel, Normal People, was released. Normal People, as listeners may know, was adapted into a very popular TV show in 2020, right before the pandemic was upon us, and it really turned her into a celebrity author. And following that, we've had Beautiful World, Where Are You?, which was released in 2021. Not as much of a splash as Normal People, but following that TV adaptation, we also had the TV adaptation of Conversations with Friends in 2022. And that kind of brings us to 2024, which is when her most recent novel, Intermezzo, was released. So to start with, I wanted to ask both of you, what is your relationship with the work of Sally Rooney? And what do we think about Sally Rooney's writing style? And do we think she's a good writer? Do you think she's a voice of a generation? Yeah, take it away. Maybe Aishwarya, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to my relationship with Sally Rooney, I think for me it was like love at first page or love at opening paragraph. I feel like I've always resonated with what she's putting out because I feel like I do feel like she is the greatest millennial author. Like I do feel like she is the voice of our generation in the same way that like I feel like Lena Dunham is the screenwriter of our generation. I feel like there's a way in which Sally Rooney's got her finger on the millennial pulse that no one else quite does. Like, I wouldn't say that every person of a certain demographic, like I wouldn't call Elif Shafak a millennial author, even though, okay, she's a bit older, but still I wouldn't use that term to describe most writers out there. But there's a way in which the Lena Dunhams and the Sally Rooneys of the world are talking about very millennial things that I feel like sets them apart from like other writers.
And what would you say those millennial things are? Like, what qualifies someone as a millennial author, apart from, how old they are and when they are born?
I honestly think one of the most hallmark traits of being a millennial is this preoccupation with the world, like worldly affairs, but from your privileged perspective. Like,
Mm-hmm.
for example, I think a very millennial character is Rory Gilmore. Nothing to do with Sally Rooney, but I think she's the ultimate millennial character who is bookish, precocious. She's considered somewhat smart, and then as she grows up, we see her fall into the trap of being this like unique snowflake millennial, and we see her entire like spiral, her descent happening because she's only able to access the world from her own tiny privileged perspective. So I feel like Sally Rooney's characters also echo that same sort of trajectory of like of being very self-involved in the same way that Lena Dunham's characters and girls have that same vibe, honestly, of just being a bit myopic when it comes to like their place in the larger world, but yet very critical of the larger world and their relationship to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so-
No, Katie.
Sorry. No, I like echo that, and to that I would also add like a lot of Sally Rooney's characters are very concerned with wokeness or like you said, affairs of the world, and there's this like typical millennial quality of sometimes even posturing wokeness but not really practicing it in your daily life. And I think that sort of comes through even with like say Peter's character in this novel Intermezzo. That I think it's definitely reflected, or Sally Rooney attempts to make like some level of commentary on that aspect of millennials and how like their politics impacts or seemingly impacts their relationships, and how that sort of like it sort of intertwines with the kind of choices that they make in terms of their partners and things like that. That's definitely been an aspect in normal people. And in fact, like a lot of people have spoken about Sally Rooney as like a Marxist writer, which I mean, I don't know, like I have some thoughts about that, but like, you know, I do feel like politics is a big aspect of her books, and the politics of her characters is a big aspect in how she sort of writes. The other thing I think is sort of the very nature of the relationships. A lot of these relationships are like kind of loosely defined, and you know, some of them venturing into polyamory, or like, you know, it's like it's a lot of situationships, which I also think is like a very millennial experience. So like in that sense, I would consider her also a millennial writer, because she touches upon these qualities, these aspects of millennial life. They're very much pervasive in her novels.
Yeah, no, I agree with both of you completely. But you know what's interesting, Aishwarya, in that comparison with Lena Dunham, the first episode of, I think it is the first episode of Girls, Hannah, Lena Dunham's character, she actually, you know, she has a little bit of a meltdown. She shows up at her parents' hotel and says, you know, I think I can really be the voice of a generation. And, you know, and she's like this down and out writer. That's her character. But I find that interesting because it's a very self-conscious attempt to be that voice of a generation, at least in Lena Dunham's case. There's this recent interview that Sally Rooney did with The Guardian as Intermezzo was being released, in which she is quite uncomfortable with that description of her. Like she's trying to shake off this descriptor of being like that voice of a generation. She's like, I don't want to be that. I don't want to attract that kind of attention. I just want to be considered, you know, a good writer who's creating good work. And, you know, that article was very interesting because it used a lot of different related artists in comparison to Sally Rooney. Lena Dunham was there, Zadie Smith. She was called the Taylor Swift of the literary world, the J.D. Salinger of the Snapchat generation. And there was even a comparison to Phoebe Waller-Bridge of the sad lit girl genre of like character. So, I mean, it's interesting because I also feel like she's working in like that novel medium where the characters are sort of meant to be like slightly grating. That's the case with even Lena Dunham and all the characters in Girls, right? And this idea of the woke but like the not self-aware character is like the hallmark of millennial angst. I find that a little hard to consume as a reader, because I feel like this writing ends up generating a lot of discourse, but is it an enjoyable read? By Sally Rooney's own definition, right? Like she's like, I don't want to be the think piece girl. I want to be a good writer. And very often when I'm reading her work, I end up asking myself, like, am I enjoying this from just a reading experience perspective? Do I like these characters? Why are they so grating? And I've often struggled with art in which there is this tendency to sort of explain away its insufficiencies. Like, for example, if you really like the character and you really relate with them, that was intentional, right? But if you find the characters grating, that was intentional too. And I feel that way about Sally Rooney. And, for example, in Intermezzo, like there was this one moment that really got to me. It was when I think it was Ivan and Margaret, and they were talking to each other, and then the conversation turned into, "Oh, do you believe in God?" And I was like, "Oh my God, what's going on?" Like, this kind of like very surface level engagement with an inane subject. I asked myself, like, is this Sally Rooney intentionally making her character this pretentious and shallow, or is this Sally Rooney herself? And is that how she writes about some of these topics? So when I'm left wondering that, like, like how much of it is like, yes, her characters are not very self-aware, but how self-aware is Sally Rooney herself, right? If I'm wondering that as I'm reading something, I don't know if I'm enjoying the quality of the writing. So that's what I've felt largely from reading Conversations with Friends, Normal People, and whatever I was able to manage of Intermezzo. Like, I really struggle. I am currently struggling with that book, but I don't know what your thoughts are about that treatment of her characters and whether it's enjoyable to read.
I think with Sally Rooney, it's also like I'm aware that her fandom is very global, and her being the defining voice of a generation means that she is like she's got access to a demographic that is very, very international. But who she is a writer writing. She's an Irish writer writing about Ireland in a way. So I do feel like there are certain cultural markers in her work that have to be treated as part of that, like that experience, that she is writing from the lived experience of an Irish perspective. So like the example that you picked up in Intermezzo of when Ivan and Margaret start, like banging on about God, I think that seems kind of random and ridiculous if you don't situate that into like their social and cultural context. Like I feel like the Catholic guilt that is endured by the Irish is almost like this subliminal presence in every single book. Like there's no character that will experience desire in this like raw way without feeling guilt and shame about it immediately afterwards. There's an awkwardness around desire that like you don't experience in other writing. So I feel like what can be grating at first glance kind of is meaningful if you like dig a little bit deeper and divorce her, like take her off the global stage and just place her where she belongs, which is either in Dublin or like in Sligo where she lives now. So yeah, that, and also to answer to the first thing you said, I think, is Sally Rooney a good writer? I think it's very interesting that she wants to kind of have this no labels approach to her own work, when in fact, like any sort of like analysis of literary fiction will mean that we are going to analyze things from the perspective of, okay, a voice of a generation, millennial writer, a writer of post-colonial fiction, a female writer. And these are just the facts and the givens of what it means to analyze anything. You need a frame of reference. And sometimes I feel like Sally Rooney wants to create really complex works, but then she wants them to be treated very simply. But I feel like for me, there's a fundamental disconnect between those two notions. Like if you are creating complexity in your writing, you have to expect complexity in people's response to it as well.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah. I do feel like Intermezzo for me is a little bit of a lazy book. Like I understand, Aishwarya, what you're saying, but like if I compare it to Normal People, which to me is like her seminal work, like it's her magnum opus or whatever, and it's also the first book that I ever read. Of course, there's a very vivid Irish experience that interplays through that book, but for me, it was, I think, the first books that I ever read where I felt like I could relate to it very deeply in terms of like how the relationship between these two people plays out. And I think like we've all sort of been in that situation where you're young and you're not really good at communicating, and then there's a lot that's unsaid. And I think it captures that aspect of young love and first love really, really well. So for me, it really felt like there was a very direct and almost instant connection that I felt to her writing. I felt like nobody that I had read before had been able to pen something like that down, or I had never seen a relationship like this, like sort of depicted in any kind of pop culture, in whatever, my limited experience, because it captures a kind of like complexity, a kind of messiness, a rawness that really stands to contrast with a lot of other kind of like romantic or like love stories that we would have typically consumed, which, try to reach a completeness. They try to reach an ending, a resolution, and this one didn't. And for me, I felt like that was a new perspective that she had to offer. And it was a wholly gripping book. Like I could not put it down, and I finished it maybe in like 48 hours, which for me is fast. But that I think I will still attribute as her best work, and still go back to and think about, the complexity of those characters and the ways in which she wrote them. Of course, now I think differently about some of the characters and some of their aspects, which we can get into, but I still feel like it was a very, well-developed, finished product. Intermezzo, on the other hand, to me kind of feels a little surface level. I don't believe a lot of the dialogue. That first interaction that Ivan and Peter have when they meet for dinner, I feel like the dialogue sort of escalates very, very quickly, and not enough context is established about the both of their relationships. And this book is also seemingly a book, or supposed to be a book, about the exploration of grief. And I feel like it's about that to some degree, but I don't know. I feel like it doesn't really come up as much for me, as opposed to it's more about like sort of the messiness of relationships, and perhaps what, maybe a life-changing event can do to relationships. But I don't know if I see a lot of grief. I feel like grief is kind of dealt with in like shallow ways, when it's like, oh, Peter is he's drinking a lot, and he's doing drugs, and he's sleeping with somebody who's like 10 years younger than him. Sure, but I don't feel like it has anything new to add to the discourse at large about grief, and even to the discourse about relationships at large. Like Normal People it changed something in the culture. It was zeitgeist defining. I don't know if this book is. And I don't know if we need to burden it with that either. But for me, as I read it, I didn't necessarily feel like I was taking away anything. But yeah, that's some of my thoughts.
I feel like a good way to just understand the Sally Rooney or the Rooniverse is just to see these books as unconventional relationships in a godless world, And I feel like that is Sally doing what Sally does best. And I think like what you were saying about Normal People, I hear you in that. I feel like her initial two books carried like a certain kind of flair that her later works are missing. And I think, and I'm not sure why that is, but maybe it's also because it was the very first time that any of us had experienced anything quite like that.
Yeah.
Because to understand Sally Rooney, we can't just talk about the themes in her work, but also the style of her writing. So like prose has walked on the backs of like descriptions for so long that to come across someone like Sally Rooney, who is completely ditching like material descriptions in favor of like this deep interiority of her characters, it's startling when you come across it. I remember having the same experience that you did with Normal People, with conversations with friends. Like I had a Kindle, I started reading the book in the afternoon, and as the day grew darker, I couldn't even bring myself to get up to switch the lights on. I just stayed there in the darkness reading conversations with friends until it was finished, because in a way that darkness helped me connect to her work better, because it's like in the same way that there is a lack of punctuation marks in her world. There are no boundaries between inner world, outer world. It's like I felt the same way. There is no need for light. The last thing we want is an illumination of what is actually happening. Let's go deep inward. It's like a sort of literary meditation of some kind to read a book without any quotation marks.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks so much, Aishwarya, because I feel like that aspect of her writing, right? Like this focus on the interior world of the characters, like a very distinct lack of quotation marks in all of her work, right? I think the way in which it shapes the reading experience is that you're really experiencing events through the subjectivity of the characters. So, there's this lack of, classical, like the classic narrator, the omniscient narrator, or the first person narrator. You're living the story through the perceptions of the characters. I mean, which is probably how we experience our world as well, right? Through our subjectivity, through our perceptions. And I think it's a powerful literary device. You're absolutely right. It kind of makes you understand that, you don't fully know what the motivations are of the other person you are speaking to. You don't always fully know a person. You're kind of receiving them refracted through your own subjectivity. At the same time, you get to understand how a particular character is, in conflict with themselves. Like, I think especially in Intermezzo, you see that a lot, right? Like, Peter's chapters are written very differently from Ivan's.
Yeah.
Right? Peter is like, his thoughts are more incoherent, more fitful. There's like this frenetic, almost intrusive nature to the way he thinks, which not very enjoyable for me to read, personally speaking. Like, I think it's a cool trick, but I think it's an interesting way to characterize someone. But what I have often felt, however, Aishwarya, like when you mentioned there is a lack of material description, and even earlier when you were talking about like all of these stories being rooted in Dublin, I feel like what ends up happening, or at least what I've felt in a lot of these stories, is that they're kind of isolated from any place, any specific place. There's no sense of place about them. I just sort of know that they are based in Dublin, and I know that she's an Irish author, and then I have this loose, like it's like a room in a building, but I have no sense of what the actual space is like, right? I'm not going away from reading these books just having like random tidbits of information about Ireland or Dublin. Like, I feel like that lack of physical context around the characters, and that prioritization of the inner world as in favor, like as opposed to the more traditional world building that you do see in a lot of novels, I feel like that ends up creating very narrow characters as opposed to the expansive characters. So I've actually felt like, where are the other dimensions of this character? I know that I feel like the baseline assumption is that these characters are incredibly complex, but I don't necessarily know how they relate to their surroundings. I don't necessarily know how they relate to ancillary characters. There are hardly any ancillary characters in any of these stories. So it's like, because how many subjectivities can you capture through this writing style, right? So I feel like that takes away where I think my thinking on the subject has evolved since I read Normal People, because it's the same thing. I read that in one sitting, and that was around 4 years ago. And now that same writing style, I struggle with. So I feel like that baseline assumption that these are very complex characters, I feel like that's kind of eroding for me, because, how many tricks will this one trick pony do? Right? I feel like I'm sounding like a hater right now, but I do think it's the same formula being applied to different characters, which is why I'm like, hey, Ivan's subjectivity kind of similar to a previous character that she's written, right? Like I feel like there's only so much you can do without getting into the outside world, without thinking about other characters, smaller characters, passing characters. So yeah.
That's a fair point. Maybe to kind of, I think we've sort of spoken about Sally Rooney as the millennial author and zeitgeist defining in a sense. I'm wondering if we should pivot this conversation and think about Sally Rooney as a female author, and how we can situate her into the larger lineage of female writers. Well, I guess there's like two questions here, right? Like, which is her depiction of women in her novel, and I think this has kind of been widely debated and And I think there's a very specific way in which she writes her women, and also just commentary about feminism at large, which does interplay through her novels. What do you think about Sally Rooney as the female author?
Yeah. When I think about Sally Rooney female characters, there is like a sort of sadness that immediately comes upon me, because all of these are young, skinny, very emaciated looking women who are often described as never eating, always stricken with physical illness, probably because they never really. And
as frail
even when they're
and like fragile.
frail, their long white fingers, their delicate wrists. I remember there's a scene in which, in conversations with friends, in which Nick grabs Frances by the hip bone, and I have tried to emulate that action so many times just to understand, like, logistically, how does anyone grab anyone by a hip bone unless they are like genuinely like sickly thin, you know? So
oh my god, like a
someone,
handle.
Yeah,
literally, not even a love handle, which is like, I understand how you grab onto that, but how do you grab onto the thing that's not there, you know? And I feel like these are women who are always like on the verge of disappearing, and then are very embarrassed about not having completed the act. You know, like they want to disappear. And then Sally Rooney's forcing them to exist on the page in this very real, visceral way. And they're not having it. They want to be gone. And I almost feel like there's a tension between the character she needs them to be and who the character actually is.
But what do you think Sally Rooney, how she fits into this lineage? Because I think this is like a departure from like the traditional heroine, right, of a book written by a woman. There is, like, as you said, there is like a frailty to these women. But another thing that honestly is the thing that I find very hard in Sally Rooney's writing is that submissiveness of women, the passivity of these women. So how would you sort of like explain that, or why do you think Sally Rooney describes these women in this way, when the tradition of female authors has been like, okay, you know what, my characters have gumption in an otherwise hostile world. Like Lizzie Bennet, Jane Austen, all of Jane Austen's heroines had like an inordinate amount of agency for the kind of like the kind of patriarchal constraints that they lived in like late 18th century, late 19th century. So why does Sally do this to her female protagonist?
I think that Sally Rooney also, it's very important to understand her political background, where like she identifies as a Marxist, and in multiple interviews she's talked about this idea of the human dependency, and that's where I think she means like a very real kind of camaraderie. And I think I definitely agree that there are more holistic and wholesome ways to portray like interdependence. Like, we've seen film after film, book after book written that is basically like a love letter to the power of female friendships, for example, which could be a much more powerful way of depicting that interdependence between humans. But when it comes to Sally Rooney writing her female characters, it's like you almost see like the conflict that she herself is perhaps experiencing, which is how do these weak women come together to make a strong friendship? And they're so young as well, like in the first two books especially. And I think that there's some sort of a tension between her Marxist idea of everybody having to be interdependent and maybe her feminist idea of like this woman having to be strong and in complete control of her agency. And I feel like then what we see on the page is the tension between these two quite dissonant ideas.
Yeah,
go ahead, Kate.
Sorry, no, I was just saying that like the thing that I've seen that almost always plays out in all of her novels is there is a dependency, of course, of these women on the men, but there is like this situation or a scene. I mean, I haven't read her third novel, but wherein the man is kind of saving the woman from her physical pain. That happens in Intermezzo, when at one point in one scene, like Sylvia's in so much physical pain, she's like lying on the floor, and then Peter comes in and helps her out and things like that. And then there's Marianne, who's attacked by her brother, and then Connell helps her. and sort of saves her in normal people. And I think that is also what triggers the reconciliation of their relationship. To me, I perceive that as, and now that I've read 3 books, I'm like, okay, yes, these women are in pain, but they are so helpless. Like, they are so helpless. Like, there is that scene in Fleabag also where she meets that older woman and they talk about how women are born with pain inbuilt into them and all of that. So, that is, of
Belinda
course,
Frears,
exactly.
the best woman in business.
Yeah. It's a very touching moment. It's a moment where you watch that and you're like, yeah, I feel seen. And the female experience is one where you do have to month on month, maybe week on week, like really deal with pain. And I feel like in Sally Rooney's novels, that is just exemplified to another level. Like in the first novel, in Conversations with Friends, Frances has endometriosis, and she also has like a really, really bad experience with it at one point where she's like not eating and she's like puking and all of that. I didn't think too much of it then, but then I feel like, okay, this seems like a recurring theme. Like in normal people, 2 relationships that Marianne is in where like her partners are into BDSM or, and I think the way that I perceived it, of course, it is consensual, but then there's the sort of flip side where her relationship with Connell is not that. And that's like, she also seems uncomfortable in that situation and in those 2 relationships. So like it is uncomfortable. It's not pleasant to read those parts of the novel. And then in this novel, there's like Sylvia, who has gone through some kind of accident which is never revealed, and she's unable to have sex because it's too painful and things like that. And again, like it bothers me so much that the situation is so helpless that there's no counter to the argument that, because she's not a provider of sex, like she can't offer Peter for fulfillment. Like, yes, Peter wanted to stay in the relationship, and yes, Sylvia was the one who broke up with him. But the underlying thread is that we can't have sex, thereby our relationship has ended. And now I'm just sort of wondering, like, what are these women supposed to be? Like, are they pawns to these men? It does make me uncomfortable the more and more I read about it, because I'm like, one, why is every single woman in so much pain? And if she is, why is every single situation such a helpless one? Why is it so helpless? Why are they so like despondent, and like then they have to rely on this male savior to come in and help them? And I think it's fine if it was in one novel, but it's like a recurring theme. So she is actively choosing to write her women like this. And that begs the question as to, why? And I suppose, there isn't a real answer. At least we wouldn't know. But yeah.
The interesting thing about Sally Rooney is that, when I've heard her describing her work, I feel like she's describing some other book altogether, because what she's saying and what the actual story in the book was, like, read completely differently to me. So in the same Guardian article, she was talking about how her own experience with love has affected her writing. And she said, quote, "Having had this experience of falling in love when I was very young with somebody who completely transformed my life and transforms it every day has allowed me to write stories about people whose lives are transformed by love." And has she written a story like that even once? Because I feel like, yes, she is, talking about messy relationships outside of like a traditional heterosexual monogamous relationship. But these relationships are kind of depleting, specifically for the woman, right? There isn't, because we don't get to a point where a relationship is established or an understanding between 2 people of who they are to each other, communicated to one another, articulated to one another. You are constantly in a situation in which you're losing on account of the relationship. If her interest, or if, as you said, Aishwarya, she wants to talk about a non-monogamous form of relationship, why is it always taking this form? Why is this the alternative? Okay, let's get out of the institution of marriage. Let's get out of anything that is repressive, that is socially repressive, right? Like, forget Jane Austen and the context that she wrote about. What baffles me as I'm reading more and more of these books is, why is this relationship transformative in the negative sense? And the thing that truly baffles me is that Sally Rooney thinks that her stories are very optimistic on the subject of love, which I have never felt when I get to the end of the story. So I don't know if there's a different interpretation that I'm not quite seeing, but yeah.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that her love stories are optimistic by any means. I feel like they're visceral. I feel like they're real. I feel like they're messy. I feel like they are very. There are certain aspects of these relationships that feel very real. Like, let's say, okay, the premise of the relationship always feels very real, but the conclusion of it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole thing of these two characters existing in deep connection that is often augmented by digital communication, but then still feeling too disconnected to really articulate their emotions and express these emotions to each other. I feel like that's a very real aspect of like modern love, modern romance, modern dating. And I feel like that's where it's relatable for all of us. But then where it sort of takes flight, like immediate and swift and speedy flight from the realm of relatability, is when the way they solve these problems leads to them taking certain decisions, like the whole Naomi, Sylvia, Peter triangle.
Yeah.
I'm not really picturing a universe in a real world in which that works out or plays out that way. And maybe that's what she's trying to say when she says her work is optimistic, that she's creating this sort of almost fantastical scenarios in which she's transforming or transmogrifying these very real world problems, these very real world relationship problems into these almost like modern fairy tale conclusions, like that polyamorous relationship, that works with three people locked in such complex power dynamics. One, like an older woman who's been, whose ability to have sex has been impaired by an accident. An older man who's in love with this first woman and is financing the lifestyle of this third woman who is a sex worker. There are so many jarring power dynamics at play there that I'm not really picturing like some realistic version of the ethical slut being played out where they all end up happily ever after in this gorgeous polyamorous relationship. So maybe that's where she drops like the literary fiction beat and goes more into the fantasy beat and experiences her work as love stories as optimistic. But in my reading of it, I wouldn't say that the conclusions are by any means realistic.
Yeah.
Katie?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. My jaw dropped and I was horrified that this is the conclusion that the book came to, which is that Peter, Sylvia and Naomi enter a polyamorous relationship. I was like, you must be fucking kidding me that this is where the book has ended. I fully agree, but to go back to the point about women, I do find it a little concerning in the sense of, I think, of course, it's okay to write about anything you want. It's her prerogative. But the thing that I find concerning is there is this sort of underlying trend, and it's sort of the way, like you said, they're sort of these skinny, frail women, and in sort of like on social media and everywhere else right now, like there's this trend going on of like the trad wife or whatever. And I'm not saying that these women are trad wives by any means or traditional in that sense, but a sub trend or maybe a larger trend that sort of influences trad wifeism or vice versa is this thing that I've been seeing of the soft girl or the soft, like a woman leading her like soft life, wherein like she's so, why should I take on all of this like hard labor? I'm so like, I'm soft. I have to like, I don't know, be soft and sit on a cloud. Yeah, and be like dainty and be taken care of. Exactly. And I just like, I can't help but make that connection here. I don't know if it's fair to her work to do that, but I can't help but make that connection because just yesterday I was watching this video of like trad wives talking about why they're trad wives and how like they submit to men because men are biologically stronger, and why should they go out there into the world and try and compete with someone who's like physically stronger than them. This is sort of like the basis of their argument, and it's also a very like sort of Christian argument.
Yeah.
And I feel like those themes kind of play out in her books. Like, and it just truly, like, of course, these are not women who are submitting, like, they are not domestic in any sense. Like, they're all sort of working women. And to Sally Rooney's credit, I suppose, working despite their pain. So, like, they are going out there into the world every day and doing all of these things. But I still think that when you as an author are continually making this active choice to write in a male savior. And the one book that I would still say is like slightly equitable in that sense is still Normal People, because I feel like it may not still be in like sort of the physical biological context, but there are times where, like, for example, when Connell is depressed, that Marianne is really there for him, and you know, these men are sort of emotionally reliant on these women. So like, I guess I don't really know what the point is that I'm making, but I guess like this is more of an observation. And it does unsettle me a little bit now as I read more and more of it, because I'm like, given the context, right? Given how feminism is evolving, it's concerning that this is like the literary event of the year, and then so many young women are sort of flocking to like read these books. When we've grown on very different models of womanhood, you know, like
for sure. I also think that like one of the reasons why Normal People feels a bit distinct from the other books is because of the way the love story concludes. Like, okay, it doesn't have like a happy ending, yes, but I think it's like the only instance in which the characters decide that each of them as individuals can do more on their own than they can with each other at that point in time. And I think in every other love story that she's writing, like the characters, no matter how messy, how complex, how even like detrimental to their own well-being a relationship is, they will always prioritize a relationship over the individual. And Normal People is the only departure from that trend where these characters all of a sudden have like the backbone, the foresightedness, the desire, just a simple desire to be themselves rather than just attach themselves to like the first person who dared love them.
Yeah.
You know, that's so interesting, Aishwarya, because when Normal People, I think, came out, or a few years ago, Sally Rooney did this sort of interview with the London Review of Books in which she was talking about Normal People. And she said this thing that she focuses on dynamics rather than characters. So she's more interested in the relational interactions between two characters than she is on characters in isolation, which, you know, immediately made me think like, who are they in their own right? And she was like, you know, I don't imagine characters in isolation. So she's like, I thought of Connell and Marianne together. She thought of what a dynamic between two young people who are exploring a certain kind of relationship or love can be. And then the characters grew from that dynamic, right? And she said that she is interested in relationships as a unit of social life. So, you know, that whole idea of like interdependence that you were talking about, like that's how that's sort of playing into just her conceptualization of a story. But again, like, you know, the kind of relationship that she does end up exploring, they tend to be like very skewed in terms of, you know, the power dynamic. And like you mentioned, Ketki, the women are dependent on the men because of their ability to physically save and protect them. And the men are dependent on the women for emotional support and guidance. And I'm like, that's one hell of a traditional gender role, man. You know, like, that's all I can think, because, you know, she does also say that she's interested in exploring how men and women can be together and how can relationships break out of traditional modes that have been constraining, right? So she's interested in that. But I cannot help but wonder, I think, and this brings us to like this larger question that we want to discuss, right? Like, why are we, I struggle to call them love stories because of how unequal some of these partnerships are. But the fact that so many millions and millions of young people, specifically women, are drawn to these stories, like, where is this resonance coming from? Like, what does this say about love, dating, and relationships today, that scores upon women are like, wow, that relationship where that man treated that woman badly, I really felt that.
Yeah.
And it used to be like, I in a half joking way call Sally Rooney the anti Jane Austen, in that Jane Austen's characters were had this agency that was very ahead of their time, but Sally Rooney's characters are women who exist in this modern world, but are very submissive and are characterized by this passivity. And I find that that contrast very, very interesting. But yeah, like, what is it that we find in this depiction of relationships? Because they're unsettling and uncomfortable for the most part.
Yeah. I find it so interesting that you brought up the Jane Austen comparison, because I think in like Sally Rooney's own understanding and her own like dialogue about her work, she will refer to herself as sort of responding to like the question of the marriage plot that Jane Austen set out to shape, But and so you're sort of primed to think of her as like following from a lineage of like these empowered female writers that were writing about women with agency ahead of their times, when in fact, like based on our discussion so far, it seems like she's following more in the tradition of like writers like Stephanie Meyer, and more in the tradition of Twilight, where it's like all of these helpless women are just being constantly saved by men, and we are over here deifying this age-old power dynamic instead of trying to unshackle ourselves from it. And if like her idea of giving and like telling an optimistic love story is just that, oh, you are no longer bound by monogamy to each other, but you can sort of twist the knife deeper in this really fucked up relationship that you already have, by now also involving more people into it, so more complexity is engineered. I find that to be a really strange perspective on what constitutes like an optimistic love story as well, or a love story worth modeling your own after, or a love story worth aspiring to.
Yeah. No, and I think there's like this article, Sanaya, you had shared with me about how there's like a relationship recession that we're in. And essentially, I like, to your earlier point where you said like, is there any truth that is reflected in these books that like women are relating to them so much? And I think there is a central, the central truth I think that is possibly reflected is that there is some level of like a disillusionment that we as a society are going through when it comes to relationships and love and dating. And in a sense, and obviously that stems from our fundamental belief or want or need or like conditioning to be in a monogamous relationship. And the truth is that if you're seeking out to find that, it's very hard, and oftentimes you're sort of finding yourself in ill-defined, poorly defined situationships, which make it worse, right? So I think that in and of itself is sort of contributing to a relationship recession at large, and also with more and more people opting to maybe stay single. Or so I think that larger disillusionment comes through, which is through these books, which is why they are not love stories possibly in a traditional sense at all, because the way that we've come to know or imagine the love story is one that fills us to some degree with some level of hope, and it ends on a positive note. And that you can have criticisms about that also, but these books do not offer that. And I think for some readers that's a refreshing perspective. I know it was a refreshing perspective to me when I read Normal People, because I was like, I've had a boy kind of like not acknowledge my presence when he was like kind of secretly in love with me and we were in high school. That has happened to me, and this is like really real. This is true. So I suppose there are other people who are resonating with these books. They're resonating with maybe also a lot of what the female characters are experiencing. So it's not to say that she's writing characters that are in and of themselves hard to believe in, or stories that are
Yeah.
hard to believe in. It's what it's all leading to. Like, what's the conclusion, in a sense, of these books, or what's the
Yeah.
main takeaway outside of like dialogue and loosely written plot?
Yeah.
That's the question, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I feel like, so the reason why I think of Jane Austen, and I know that, this is the response to the marriage plot, but I feel like Jane Austen was radical for her time, because the economist Alice Evans, who's done like quite a bit of work on research on gender norms, and she essentially wrote that Jane Austen's work is this radical idea which is masking itself as a romance. And the radical idea basically is that of an equal partnership where a man is devoted to the woman, at a time when, marriages were transactional, economic in nature. Men had complete control over women's lives. So it was truly radical for women to start aspiring towards romantic love in the context of a marriage. And I think those books created expectations and aspirations, right, among women in the 18th century, women in the 20th and 21st century as well, right? How many modern day Jane Austen adaptations have all of us watched as a part of growing up?
Yeah.
And how much has it like influenced the romance genre? With Sally Rooney, I agree. I think it does not create an escape or something to want in your life. Like, you don't want that kind of relationship in your real life. Like, at the end of it, you're not thinking of Peter as this dreamy guy that you would love to get to know in your real life. Like, I just wish there was someone like this. Like, there is no equivalent to Darcy, right, in her books.
Yeah.
The men are generally like slightly pathetic. I don't know how else to think of them, but at the same time, I feel like, reflecting the realities of modern dating, which is, this no label relationships. Like, I don't know if I've ever read a Sally Rooney book in which they DTR or define the relationship between themselves. Maybe the polyamory situation will require a lot more communication. But we do live in a situation where there, as you said, Katie, people are disillusioned with feminism, right? There are studies that show that young men are more likely to hold sexist beliefs and attitudes than men of an older generation. So, like, and women have fewer and fewer reasons to get into relationships, right? Like, that financial requirement is gone. So now you're just looking for a partner who can reciprocate emotionally, which has led to this so-called relationship recession. But I feel like what Sally Rooney's books, like, where they fall short for me, is that you're so interested in just the form of a relationship and what you call it, that I don't think it ever really fully or meaningfully deals with, the emotional fallout of characters treating each other badly, right? I like, how is that not a part of this negotiation?
There's little responsibility that characters take. There is no responsibility that they take, in fact. Like, outside of Connell apologizing to Marianne at that point in time. And I don't even mean literally responsibility, or like that they have to perform a certain kind of action, but just like a consideration even. I don't think that's depicted at all.
Yeah, I think like Peter is consistently, holding back or withholding information from Sylvia and from Naomi. And there's also this, what was interesting to me, like, the women in the stories, they have an idea of a certain kind of man whom they think is desirable to other women, right? Like, both Marianne and Naomi at one point, like, say in reference to Connell and Peter, like, I bet like you slept with many women, or I bet that all the girls are really into you. and they don't say anything in response. Like these men, they're like, okay, I'll let you believe that, because you believing that gives me a certain kind of upper hand. So I find that very difficult to come to terms with, because yes, modern life is very messy, modern relationships are disappointing, but you don't want to read something that does not actually explore accountability in a
Yeah.
meaningful way, that does not explore the sense of self that you sort of retain even in a relationship, no matter what the form. It doesn't explore that at all. Her interest in the dynamics between two characters, because these are very real things as well. And, I've always felt like the messiness of modern relationships, that topic is more radically and meaningfully dealt with in a lot of like singer songwriter pop music, right? Like, just like, for example, in recent times, there have been so many songs that are exploring this idea of a situationship or a relationship that was never really defined well, or someone who is like playing on the affections of more than one person and how that makes you feel, right? Like examples would include Casual by Chapel Roan, right? Where
Yeah.
in the song, she's like describing these situations between her and her partner that are not casual, quote unquote casual. Like, I'm leaving clothes in your house, so are we casual now? And she's asking her partner, this, you've invited me to your mom's house. I'm spending time with your family. I'm leaving my clothes in your house. Traditional markers of relationships. But are we still casual? Is that what you're going to call us? And what I appreciate about that kind of a stance is that it's confronting messiness, but there's a defiance. Like there's like, Chapel wants to be treated better. There's a desire to want more for yourself. And, even like all of Short and Sweet, Short and Sweet is literally about short and sweet relationships, like situationships, in which
Yeah.
Sabrina Carpenter is like talking about, intimacy and desire and, being really horny. A lot of it is about that. And sex is a big part of what binds two people in Sally Rooney relationships as well. But there is a sort of knowingness, right? I know that this relationship is not ideal. I knew that what you were giving me wasn't enough, right? And I just don't feel like her characters or her stories have that knowledge or sense, right? Like even the folklore trilogy of songs, right?
Yeah.
August, Betty, and Cardigan, they're all like, especially August, she's not being treated well, but she knows it. And
Yeah.
I'm so many times I'm wondering, I'm like, Naomi, you sent this guy a picture of yourself in a dress, and he was just like, I'm at work right now, so like, don't bother me. Like, doesn't she not want to keep being at the receiving end of that? So that's where I get disappointed, where I think the lack of sense of self stops these characters from wanting more. And yeah, I think that's what makes me sad. And I really hope that this is not the only kind of story that Sally writes in the future. But yeah, I'm just sort of wondering, like, can a love story in this environment be a hopeful thing?
I think what we were talking about earlier about like these stories not just being like sort of aspirational but also reflecting the state of affairs as they are is maybe something to come back to here, because if we sort of come back to like the characters and girls, or even in Fleabag, like a theme we seem to come across over and over again is women struggling with their agency, right? Not everyone is just throwing the agency in the dustbin quite in the same way as like a Sally Rooney character, but the struggle of like I feel like a lot of people are disillusioned with a certain kind of she can have it all kind of feminism.
Mm-hmm.
And like we see Fleabag struggling with it. We see everyone and girls struggling with even like the basic thing of how to have anything at all, forget having it all, like how do I have one thing, and I think or I feel like each of these three things, like Sally Rooney, Fleabag, and Girls, are responding to that question of how to have it all in a very different way. And I think the Sally Rooney character is like, you know what, having it all is so difficult. I'm actually just going to have nothing and completely submit to this man who is now going to care for me, protect me, and provide for me. And that's going to be where my sense of meaning in this world comes from this feeling of transformative love and being cared for. And it's undeniable that like a lot of people out there, no matter how much feminist jargon we throw around, are really still just looking for someone to fall in love with. And no matter how good their life is outside of that, they will never truly feel complete unless this sort of like love as salvation model is fulfilled in some capacity.
That was really well put.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, hard agree.
I also have seen this interview of Sally Rooney where she basically rejects this idea or like this self-care culture wherein she's just like, this idea that you can just sort of like opt out of human society and not really be reliant on people is flawed. And that, you can, and the context is slightly different. I don't think she's speaking about like romantic relationships. She's basically talking about this idea wherein it's like, relationships are complex or people are toxic. So fuck them. And I'm just going to like do my own thing. And I'm going to, like this whole thing of like, you do you care for yourself. Like that's a lot of like, that was a dominant theme. And I think like she's a vehement like critic of that idea. It very much comes through in her books, but I think it just reaches a whole other extreme wherein it's like, the complexities are so dire and the female characters are so
they're not eating. Like, forget self-care. They're not eating.
She's just completely pushing them to the other extreme entirely. But yeah. It is.
I mean, I think we can.
Sorry, no, go for it.
No, just that, like, I feel like we can see that Sally Rooney is, like, vehemently allergic to the notion of individuality in any capacity. She doesn't think of individual characters, she thinks of dynamics. She doesn't believe in self-care, she denies selfhood even to characters.
Exactly.
So I think, it's interesting that we see her as the zeitgeist-defining writer of our times, because if anything we can see from like the evolution of the novel from the beginning of time is that stories were first told about like gods and natural calamities, like the Epic of Gilgamesh is about a flood. Then stories became about kings and empires. Then stories became about love and marriage. And now stories are often about individuals. And Sally Rooney has, in a sense, she's taken one step forward and one step backward in that tradition where, yes, she is now writing about something even more fractured than the individual, which is the interiority of these people. But then she's also taking one step back where she's also using this interiority to somehow deny them their selfhood. So where are we going, Sally? There's like a fork in the road, and I'm not quite sure what like her next work is going to be about. Or actually, I'm very sure, because it's going to be about exactly what it's about.
That's really, really well put. And I guess in that sense, she is a voice of a generation in that very, very sense, because I really truly think that like 20, 30 years down the line, when we're trying to like define this period and think about like the pop culture and sort of the overarching societal themes and trends, etc., that define this period, I do think her books will be referred back to.
Yeah.
I do think so. Whatever criticism we may have of them, they do hold up some kind of a mirror to society.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Sally Rooney is canon. This has happened.
Yeah. No, and I really like that image of we're at a fork in the road. We don't know what road we're going to go down. There is like a resurgence of like traditional roles, but the big difference being that now women are opting for them. So, the idea of like submitting yourself to this benevolent man, right? But and it's different from what was there originally, which is that you're submitting yourself, but this man is gentle and kind and cares for you, and you don't need to worry when you're around him. And that being the, I don't want to call it radical, but maybe that is the contribution. Yeah, so I guess that brings us to, I think we can go on talking about this forever. For sure, this is fascinating. Just because of everything said and done, Girl inspires a lot of discourse and discussion, and I'm grateful for that. This podcast is grateful for that.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. Thanks, Aishwarya, for joining us. Hope you had a good time on the Thinking People podcast.
Bye. Thanks so much for listening. Thinking People podcast is hosted by Sanaya Chandar and Ketki Sharma. Our producer for this episode is Saurav Das.
You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio content. Be sure to follow us at Thinking People Pod on Twitter or X and at Thinking People Pod on Instagram. If you'd like to get in touch, write to us at thinkingpeoplepodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode.